Last year, you and I looked at the Ford Coupé for an old school approach to the affordable coupe in the 1980s. But today on TwinCam, we're looking at a car that took a very different but at the same time very similar approach to that same market. This is a Mk2 Volkswagen Scirocco, completing all of its wedgy goodness. Before we begin, this car is for sale at Stockley Classics, so if you're interested, then please do follow the link in the description. The original Volkswagen Scirocco was a striking bit of car design, carrying an ultra-modern appearance that instantly drew glances. The straight-edge coupe was famously based on the Golf, but the Scirocco actually predates it by a few months, allowing Volkswagen to iron out any faults in what was an absolutely critical car for the company. Therefore, they didn't need to be radical or shake up the proven recipe. In a remarkable turn in form, Volkswagen absolutely could rest on their laurels when it came to replacing their coupe. As a result, the Mk2 Scirocco is still based on the original Golf, and it carries over the majority of its componentry. Launched in 1981, the Mk2 Scirocco was the final car to be based on that A1 platform, predating the Mk2 Golf by a couple of years. But though this was in effect a heavy facelift of the original, this car comprehensively refreshed the appearance of the Scirocco. The original was penned by Giugiaro, as was the Golf, but for the Mk2, Volkswagen took the styling into their own hands. They'd done this with a few cars already, and would echo Giugiaro's style throughout their next generation of cars. Though the styling is therefore based on the original, this Mk2 updates the style by a decade. Though not as striking and slightly softer, there's so much more going on in the design here than there was with the Mk1, and as a result, Volkswagen masked the age of the basic car extremely well. The black plastic wheel arch extensions, side skirts, oversized bumpers and rear wing on this particular example all add a sense of dynamism and sporting intent vital in attracting customers to a coupe in the image-conscious 1980s. Compare that to the stark though striking original and the attitude is completely different. The Mk2 accentuates its coupe body style through an increase in length by 33 centimeters, allowing it to look sleeker and much lower than the Mk1, despite a drop of only 5 mm. Similarly, the wheel arch extensions add about 2 centimeters to the width, and though that's minimal, it allows it just to look that little bit beefier. Also altered is the Glasshouse. The rear windows are much larger, thinning out the rear pillars and increasing visibility, though this also brings the styling more up to date. But the wing that surrounds and cuts through the rear screen is what I feel sets the Scirocco off. Despite the rather conservative overall style, the contrasting body kit on this example beefs up the car to the point where there's no question which decade this car hails from. But on a more basic Scirocco that lacks the body kit, or an example with it in body colour, instead a seemingly different character emerges. One that, on a body kit equipped car at least, retains a low sporting stance but combines that with the prettiness and elegance of the simple Giugiaro inspired origami style. As it happens, that would be my chosen Scirocco, as I enjoy that origami style and its overall wedginess. But as a piece of history, the car we have here today is more indicative of its era. And that is the crux of the Scirocco's appeal. Both the Golf and Scirocco were beautiful designs, but the factor that would push people into buying a Scirocco would be the sleekness, dynamism and youthfulness implied by the coupe styling, and in this case, the beefiness of the body kit. That's where we can relate it to a car like the Ford Coupé, chosen as I've done a video on one. Though with two very different characters, both these cars use the engineering from an ordinary family car and dress them up in bodywork that's hard to resist. What may have increased the Scirocco's appeal was a Targa top, and Volkswagen did make a prototype, which is very, very cool. But unfortunately only the Coupé was produced, though this one does have a sunroof. Bring back the sunroofs. A priority of the early 1980s was in finally dealing with the elephant in the room of aerodynamics. For decades, manufacturers had barely attempted to produce slippery shapes, and though the Mk2 Scirocco wasn't an industry leader, Volkswagen did manage to bring the drag coefficient down from 0.42 to 0.38, and that's not bad at all considering it is, in effect, a very heavy facelift. Increasing the car's aerodynamic efficiency was one of Volkswagen's two main objectives in the development of the Mk2, and the other was in practicality, which had the opportunity to increase sales directly. Along those lines, the Scirocco does attempt to be a full four-seater, but it's a bit tight back here, especially compared to the Coupé, which seems to be the car I'm comparing this a bit to, mainly because I've done a video, but also because that car goes about this market in a completely different way, seemingly. Although it is about a decade older, yeah, there's not quite as much room here as there is in a Coupé, and also I'm right up against the headlining as well, so although this is more practical than the Mk1 Scirocco apparently, it's still not quite as good as I was maybe expecting it to be. Moving around to the back though, this is a properly cavernous boot, and at the end of the day, if you do own a Scirocco, there's less chance you're going to be carrying people and more chance you could use the space in the back here. There is a penalty to having a Scirocco over a Golf, and compared to one of its German competitors, it does fall short. But that's because the Scirocco is physically smaller, and as I mentioned, having that larger boot is more useful in a car like this than that bit of extra legroom. Where the Scirocco really does pull ahead of any affordable coupe though is in the quality of its design and production. Volkswagen products of the 1970s and 1980s are responsible for the perception today that the group's cars are a cut above. Today the story may be different, but in 1981 no doors thunked shut like those on a Volkswagen. Not even a manufacturer like BMW could match that, and though Volkswagens were relatively expensive in the UK, they were viable alternatives to the Fords, Vauxhalls and Austins that the majority of the population was rocking about in. Even these door handles are a work of industrial art. Not designed to be pretty, but they become beautiful with the execution of their engineering. Like the original Scirocco and the Karmann gear that preceded it, the Mk2 Scirocco was built not by Volkswagen, but by Karmann, who at the time were producing the Golf Cabriolet. Karmann was essentially a contract manufacturer, so companies like Volkswagen could ask Karmann to produce a car for them if their own factories were to capacity or for specialist production techniques. On what was a relatively niche product, it made perfect sense for Karmann to produce the Scirocco for Volkswagen. A similar thing still happens today with companies like Magna Steyr producing cars for Mercedes-Benz, BMW and Jaguar. Karmann was eventually broken up after insolvency proceedings following the financial crisis, and guess who bought most of their production systems? That's absolutely right, it's Volkswagen. Back to the 80s though, and outsourcing the production of a car to a contract manufacturer like Karmann can actually be telling of the final quality of the product. You see, a company like Karmann only makes its business through contracts, and therefore their final quality control had to be high. Combine that with the already very good quality reputation of Volkswagen in the 1980s, and that's a good omen for the Scirocco. The interior is more of the same. It's very functional with no frills, and though some of the plastics are closer to standard levels than I'd expected, the design gets the basics just right. What this dashboard isn't is nicked out of any other Volkswagen. It's unique to the Scirocco, complete with a shallow angle, echoing the sleekness of the body. The 4-spoke steering wheel with off-centre Volkswagen badge is shared with other VWs however, and though the overall grey and black interior theme is rather sober, it seems to suit the character of the car. The rows of LEDs in the instrument cluster for the warning lamps are rather quaint though. The gear lever is where we start to see the practicalities of a car like this, and why consumers in period were so enamoured by a stylish coupe based on an existing family car rather than opting for something genuinely sporting. The ratios are advertised as 4+E for economy, and though this car is badged as a GT, for a 1987 car that means poverty spec. That's why we have the 14-inch Steelies with the hubcaps, which I predictably adore, and under the bonnet is a 1595cc overhead cam 8-valve 4-cylinder fed by a carburettor, pushing out about 75 brake horsepower to the front wheels. Up at the top of the range was the later Scirocco GTX with the same engine as the Mk2 Golf GTI 16-valve. With those extra valves, 1.8 litres and Bosch fuel injection, the 140 horsepower at 6,100 RPM propelled the Scirocco to 60 mph in about 8 seconds, a time that was really genuinely quick, eclipsing the Scirocco's competitors. The GTX also benefited from disc brakes at the back and vented discs up front, stiffer suspension, a thicker rear anti-roll bar and a front lower strut brace. That's all attached to the mechanical recipe that made the A1 platform so well loved and so successful in period. Front wheel drive with McPherson struts at the front and a torsion beam with trailing arms at the back. It's in this mechanical layout that the Scirocco sets itself apart from the majority of its competition. The aforementioned Ford Capri and its main rival, the Opel Manta, were both slightly larger and rear-wheel drive, seeming to hail from an era before the Scirocco, despite existing at the same time. But the slightly more sophisticated offerings from the Japanese were maybe more in line with the 1980s, such as the Toyota Celica and Nissan Silvia, though both of these were more powerful than the Scirocco, sticking again with rear-wheel drive. Something else to throw in is the Honda CRX. A little smaller it may have been, but much more equivalent in terms of power and with front-wheel drive. With this, I'm not particularly looking to compare the Scirocco, but to point out that in the decade of the hot hatch, there were still a number of cool coupes out there for the taking. But Volkswagen Scirocco does a better job of sophistication than any of the above. And most importantly, it's an illustration of Volkswagen during the decade in which they cemented their reputation in the UK. As I mentioned earlier, this car is for sale at Stockley Classic, so if you'd like a classic VW or a cool, sleek, wedgy 80s coupe, then do follow the link in the description. And on that note, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. It really does make a difference. I'm forever indebted by my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link for that in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.